150,000 Arab Americans live in the Chicago area today. Most are Palestinian and Lebanese, but the local community is also home to Arabs from Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Award-winning journalist Hanania writes about the history of Arabs in the Chicago area in his new book, Arabs in Chicagoland. It traces the journey of Arabs in the Windy City from the arrival of the first Lebanese Christians in the mid-19th century to the current wave of immigration today. He says the first wave of Arab immigration followed the 1893 World's Fair.
My own grandfather, and I didn't even know this until I started researching it, came here and sold things at the Columbian Exposition. And I'm going, wow, you know. In other words, his first contact with the United States was at this 500-year anniversary of Columbus discovering America. And as I researched it more at the Chicago Historical Society and other sources, I found out that Arabs had a very big presence at the Columbian Exposition. And, you know, outside of Farida Mazer doing the Hoochie Coochie dance, or Ali Yagbi, who was one of the guys that was very popular at the time, there were several hundred Arabs who just lived normal lives for several years in Chicago and recognized right away this was a great place to bring the souvenirs of the Middle East and the Holy Land without, and there wasn't any of this political conflict associated with it, and they could sell that to Americans, and Americans loved it. You know, the olive wood carved camels, the mother of pearl little picture frames with the, Last Supper. So all of a sudden, the stories that would then flow through the rest of the Middle East were about, look, you could take your trade, come to America, make a lot of money, and be successful.
The period from roughly 1890 to 1920 is what you've identified as sort of a first wave of Arab immigration to the Chicago area. What was life like for those earliest immigrants?
One of the earliest immigrants that I actually interviewed back in the 70s was a guy named Jamal Khatib, who I profiled. And he told me, and I actually have the tape of the interview that I gave to the family, because as I was going through all my collections of pictures and tapes and things, I said, wow, this family 25 years, 30 years ago, here's their father talking about what it was like. I got to get this to him. But he talked about how, he was single. He had heard that you can come to America, make money, find a living. They had a cousin who lived in Chicago, so they had the guy's address. They took the boat, they came here, they took the train from New York to Chicago. They get to Chicago in the middle of January at 2 o'clock in the morning. A cab driver drops them off at 18th and Michigan, and they're freezing to death because they don't have a coat and they have their suitcase. And they're standing out there for almost 2 hours, and an Arab guy drives by and sees them. He says, hey, are you guys Arabs? What are you doing out in the middle of the snow with no coat? He says, so he takes them to the coffee shop, and this guy, Jamal Khatib, told me about how they would, get into peddling, and they referred to it as the door of God. To get an American woman to open her door to an Arab-looking guy with dark skin, black hair, trying to sell junk out of a suitcase was like trying to get God to open his door to heaven. It was very that difficult.
But that was the way in which many of the earliest immigrants made their living.
Absolutely.
What kinds of things did they peddle?
Immigration is about friendship and assistance. You have a relative that lives here, and they help you get on your feet. Well, as it turned out, the culture had a contacts here. There was a man who owned a wholesale store, and you would come here and you would go, a cousin would introduce you to him, and that was right around 18th and Michigan, and he would give you a suitcase of brushes, bras, slips, knives, all kinds of things, and he'd say, look, take it on consignment. Whatever you sell, we'll inventory it, you take a commission, and that's how you're going to make money. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to know how to speak English. Just go there and, here's the price. Just make sure you get the price for whatever's on it. So it was an easy way to come into society, assimilate, at least in terms of making money, and that's what happened. Later on, years later, there was a man who worked at the Crammel Milk Company, and Crammel Milk had an Arab American who said, listen, if you're looking for a job, we will loan you the money to open a store in the inner city if you promise to only sell Crammel Milk dairy products. So all of a sudden you have all these Arab Americans coming in and opening stores in the inner city because Crammel Milk wants to create this monopoly on the dairy, the dairy sales. And it worked for a lot of people. It was amazing. And they bought their stores from other immigrants. That was the amazing thing. It wasn't like they just opened them out of nowhere.
You mentioned 18th and Michigan. That was really the heart of the Arab community in Chicago. Why was that the centerpiece for Arabs in Chicago in the early days?
Well, it was, we refer to it as like our Plymouth Rock. I mean, essentially Arabs would come here and go where other Arabs were located. I mean, most of the Arabs in the turn of the century came from two places. They were either Lebanese Christians from Lebanon, Mount Lebanon in Syria, or they were Muslim Palestinians from Batunia, which is a sister city of Ramallah. And at the turn of the century, the majority of Arabs came from those two areas. Why? I'm not quite sure, but I think it had to do with the ability to get visas to come to the country. A village would actually get the visa. If they knew that Arabs were living in 18th and Michigan, that's where the Arab immigrant would go. And usually it was a male, either married with a family back home or a young, single Arab who was sent off to go raise money and send it back to the family back home. And that person knew that he was going to find some identity where he could get support. And as long as you could get a foothold in America, you could be very successful. And that was the key. 18th and Michigan became that identity not only for Arab Americans, but even in Chicago. It used to be Automobile Row. And, there were a couple, I think, Chicago Confidential wrote this little thing about, oh, you love to go there, it's very mystical, but you don't want to see any harems because the women wouldn't be of your taste. I'm going, I don't know, I think he just said something bad about me. I wasn't sure.
Well, it was also in the days of the infamous First Ward nearby along what's now Cermak.
Sure, you would buy a license to peddle from Hinky Dink Kenna and Bathhouse John Coughlin. And another man that I interviewed in the book back in the 70s, and he was a senior at that time, is a guy named Hassan Halim, who was one of the people who helped found the mosque that is now in Bridgeview. But when he got here, he bought his license to peddle from the alderman, and he said he had to pay for the license, and he had to give them a gratuity to thank you. Now, that was a polite way of calling it a bribe. But to hear this story, to say, wow, you guys, you came here and you were part of that system. This isn't just a story about Arab Americans. This is a story about America. You're part of that story. And if we don't tell our story, I think Americans are missing out. It's like leaving something out of the picture.
We're talking here on 848 on Chicago Public Radio with award-winning journalist Ray Hanania. He's written the new book, Arabs of Chicagoland. What's your own family story?
My dad's family is from Jerusalem, and my mother's family is from Bethlehem. My dad was going to be a lawyer. This was in the 1920s. He had a brother, an older brother, who came to the States in the 20s, and another older brother who was an activist in the Palestine-Israeli Jewish conflict at the time. His older brother drowned in the pool near Jerusalem, and people who saw him yelling for help, Muslims thought he was Jewish, Christians thought he was non-Christian, Jews thought he was Muslim. Nobody would help him. My dad was so upset about that report that was written by the police, the British police at the time, that he decided he was going to leave, come to the States, and join his brother Moses. Moses was a cook at a Rolling Green Country Club up in Arlington Heights, in that area. He was a chef. And he got my dad a job, and then my dad ended up settling along Clybourne Avenue at, I think, about 2200 North, and he worked at the Astor Theater. So he came here as a result of wanting to get away from what he thought was his hatred and animosity.
How were he and others received by non-Arabs here in Chicago when they were here?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, back in the 20s, I think he was received very well. He did very well. He got a job, to the point where when he married my mother in the 1950s, when I was born, he was insistent that I speak English, not Arabic. So he had assimilated very successfully. So I think it made a difference in terms of even how I was raised.
Your family, your father in particular, was part of what's considered to be a second wave of Arab immigration to Chicago, a period that roughly runs from 1930 to 1970.
Right.
As a child growing up in that time who was Arab American, what was your experience like?
Most of the Arabs in Chicago that we knew lived around South Shore Valley. It was a prominent Jewish community, and to think that the Palestinians would intentionally move into a Jewish community because they actually got along with the Jewish community very well. So I grew up going to Warren Elementary School. There were Jews and Arabs in the school. We knew each other. There was a sense of identity. that was there that, kind of changed, after the '67 war. But it was, I think it was a typical American upbringing.
How did the experiences of Arab Christians differ from the experiences of Arab Muslims who came to Chicago?
They didn't differ much until later on. I think because there's a much greater awareness of the religious differences. There's a more political activism in the Muslim community. There are Islamicists, which are a little bit different than, secular Muslims. Back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was predominantly a secular Muslim community, very committed to their religion, just like we were committed to our Christian religion. But today there's a more activism, and that fell into this third wave where people came here because of the rising conflicts, because of the, all kinds of upheavals and changes in the Middle East. I mean, people didn't come here to make money. They came here to be free, they came here to express an opinion, or they came here carrying the burden of their politics so they could champion that political message here in a country where they felt they would be free to do that.
And that's the third wave that you've really identified as 1970 to the present.
Right.
And how has the community evolved as a result?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there are positives and negatives. The positives are the community is significantly larger. I dug up some research that had been completed in some dissertations in the 1950s and the 1970s by Arabs who looked at the community, and I compared that, and I mentioned that in the book, with the community today. I mean, there were 15,000 or 18,000 Arabs in Chicago in the 70s. Today there are about 250,000 in the Chicago area, maybe about 135 in Chicago, 70,000 in suburban Cook, and another 20 or 25,000 in the remaining 6-county region. There are no accurate statistics. So the good part was our community was growing. The bad part was that we didn't have a sense of communications the way other communities did. We still are struggling with our own news media. We don't have a really good news media that reports on our social achievements. One thing about being a journalist that I learned is sometimes you publish something just to be a publication of record. You want to define yourself for later on, so when people look back at you, you don't have to keep explaining it. There's a book, there's a newspaper. Most of our newspapers were politically focused. 90% of everything they wrote was about the Middle East conflict. All the books we wrote were about the Middle East conflict. Nobody looked at our own community, and we didn't look at
here
ourselves.
in Chicago.
Right. Even across the country. Now, there are, over the last 10 or 15 years, there have been some authors that wrote about their experiences. But there was no sense of looking within ourselves and saying, okay, Ray, forget about the politics. What was it like just growing up in South Shore Valley? What was it like, being the first Arab family in Burbank? What was it like, being the first Arab, journalist at the Sun-Times or whatever? We're one of the first. What were those things like? Because people behind you are looking for examples of how to walk in life. So if you don't record your life, it's not just to celebrate yourself, but people behind you need some confidence that, I know what to expect. I can anticipate it. You deal with life a lot better when you have role models.
We're talking here on 848 on Chicago Public Radio with Ray Hanania. He's an award-winning Chicago journalist, former reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times and the Southtown Economist, among other publications. He's also an author and a humorist, and he's written a new book titled Arabs of Chicagoland. It's a history of Arab Americans in the Chicago area. We can't talk about the recent history of Arabs in the Chicago area without talking about September 11th. And there were a number of reports in the days immediately following the September 11th terrorist attacks of significant discrimination, significant outrage directed at Arabs here in the Chicago area. What effect have those events and subsequent events had on the community?
On one hand, it's driven the moderate mainstream community underground. They're less, at least, initially they were hiding. Women who would wear the hijab, which Muslim women would wear the head covering, would take it off because, it would draw attention to them and cause some hostility or, invite hostility. All these shops along Little Petunia, which is along Harlem Avenue between 87th and 95th Street, there were 18 stores that had their windows broken. They had that riot and protests in front of the mosque in Bridgeview. These things happened at different levels all over the country. Even I would notice it because I remember driving into the Orland, I live in Orland Park, and I remember driving into the Orland Square Mall and pulling up next to a car, and a car was parked there, and apparently, this was a few days after September 11th, the owner was so enraged that he wrote these angry sentences in paint. He painted words on his car, his big Ford, and the back window said, if you want to see Allah, A-L-A, or Jihad, J-A-H-A-D, mess with an American. Now, I'm sitting here going, wow, did he write that because he thought Osama bin Laden was going to come here and get a haircut at Borex? Or did he write it because he's angry with, he knows there are a lot of Arab Americans, and he wants to get in our face, and he wants to provoke us, and he wants a confrontation. That type of environment was very dangerous. You could provoke confrontations very easily just by looking at somebody wrong. I remember even on Flag Day, my father was a veteran, my uncle was a veteran, my brother was a Marine, I served during the Vietnam War in the Air Force. We would put our flag out all the time. And I remember on Flag Days before September 11th, you'd look out the neighborhood, you'd rarely see more than 2 or 3 flags on a block. On September 11th, it was like, I didn't have to buy a flag, but all of a sudden every neighbor had a flag, and they all seemed like they were pointed at my house. I got this sense of a little paranoia, I admit, but there was suddenly this patriotism that was, we're American and you're not. Didn't matter what you did. Didn't matter who you were. Didn't matter your history. You're Arab. That was it. You're on the other side of the line. That was a very difficult time for people to live. We had 7 Arab American newspapers prior to September 11th. 6 of them closed right after September 11th. We've just seen the rise of a new newspaper this past year called The Future News, which is English and Arabic. That took 4 years for them to get back off the ground to feel comfortable enough that they could publish a newspaper without being attacked. Because a newspaper is almost like an invitation for anger. So it's become a lot easier. But it's still out there. The people that still don't understand, that are angry, and they look at me, and for them, I'm their point of anger. They need to express their anger, and I'm the way to do it. They see my face, they see me as Middle Eastern, and fortunately, I don't ever feel like I've ever had to be, like I was in danger at all.
Well, what do you say though when confronted with a situation like that?
Well, that's how I actually got into stand-up comedy. A friend of mine, Todd Whitman, we were at this Columbia journalism luncheon right after September 11th, and he and his friends came out. Todd's a good friend of mine. He's a producer. You probably know him. He said, Ray, why did you do this? I said, me? What did I do? And I was so frustrated, I started making jokes with him. And there was no, how do you answer a question that's totally off base? You can't. How do you tell the woman that, being Christian is very compatible with being Arab? The first Christians are from the Middle East. How do you tell people that I'm an American just like you? I had nothing to do with September 11th. That's a whole different, it's not, there's a very complicated political process out there. You can't just lump everybody together. It's bad for you to do it as Americans. It was a very difficult thing to deal with. It's still, if people are angry at some point, you just have to step back and say, listen, I understand your anger, but there's more to it, and hope that they come to their senses.
What do you think the chances are that more people will start to see this in the way that you've just described?
Well, that was another reason for writing the book. I thought, okay, if Americans are, non-Arab Americans are really concerned about the Middle East, they really should know who we are. Education, accuracy, truth are that's the best defense against terrorism.
The book is titled Arabs of Chicagoland. It's written by award-winning Chicago journalist Ray Hanania. He's an author, a humorist, and a columnist for the Southwest News Herald. Ray, thanks very much.
No problem. Thank you.
This is a excerpt from the book Arabs of Chicagoland, beginning on page 39, and it is a profile of Khalil Suleiman Zeyad, Z-A-Y-I-D. Khalil Suleiman Zeyad first came to Chicago in 1939 and served as the Arab American community's first imam, which is the Muslim version of a priest. By then, there was a strong Arab and Muslim community growing around 18th and Michigan Avenue. Like many of his counterparts from the Middle East, Khalil left his home village of Betunia because of the poor conditions and the terrible economic times leading up to World War II. He also was concerned about making a better life for himself and his family, which remained in Betunia. His brothers and father pulled money together to pay for his trip. This is a quote from his daughter, Miriam Zeyad, who is married into another Zeyad family, Z-A-Y-E-D. He used to tell us the story of how a Jewish tenant of one of my father's buildings helped him fill out the paperwork so he could come to this country, his daughter Miriam Zeyad said. He would tell us the stories of when he came to this country. When he got here, he stayed with Hassan Halim and others. They helped him by giving him a suitcase with a permit sticker on it, and they told him to go sell. He said he didn't know how to do it or how to get the people to open their doors so he could get them to look at what he had in his suitcase and sell it to them. But he quickly learned. She continues, "My dad lived in a rooming house with Mr. Halim. Every penny he made, he sent back to his family in Betunia, which is a city next to Ramallah in the West Bank, north of Jerusalem." She added, "They used the money he sent them to purchase land with it back home, and that helped them have a better standard of living in life. It made a difference for them. They weren't rich, but they were living comfortably thanks to what my father was doing," Miriam Zeyad remembers. In 1947, she notes, "My father came back home to Betunia and he married my mom, Shemsa, in 1947. They came here to Chicago and she lived with him on 18th Street for a few years with Mr. Halim until she had her third child. That's when they decided to buy a home. You have to remember the mentality back then was that they were here to make money and then go back home." Khalil Zeyad was among the founders of the Mosque Foundation, which was formed in the 1950s to help raise money to build the region's first mosque. The Mosque Foundation purchased an old church at 65th and Stewart Avenue in Chicago, and they used that as a school and a community center. Miriam Zeyad explained, "They didn't have Friday services because they didn't have a full-time imam to conduct the services, and they didn't have a mosque back then," she recalls, "but the community center at 65th and Stewart was big. I remember going there. There were only a few Muslim families in Chicago when I attended the school there, and when it opened, I was very young, but I remember going there often. It was the first Arab Muslim center there. I think there were only about 50 Arab Muslim families in Chicago at that time." Miriam continues her recollection about her father, saying, "The Muslim community also rented a conference hall at the YMCA at 71st and Exchange Avenue in South Shore, where they would hold special holiday services for the Eid, or in English, the holiday, and the Eid al-Adha, which was the high holiday associated with Ramadan, the holiest period for Muslims. The community center at 65th and Stewart was nice. It had a school. It was really big. We were young," Miriam Zeyad recalled. "They taught us our religion, different verses from the Quran, and they also taught us the Arabic alphabet." The 65th and Stewart Center was sold around 1964, and the money from the sale was used as a down payment on the purchase of land at 91st Street near Harlem Avenue, the location today of the Bridgeview Mosque. In the meantime, they converted a storefront at 79th and Clyde Avenue in South Shore as a new community center. These and other stories are found in the book Arabs of Chicagoland by Arcadia Publishing through their series Images of America. It includes about 200 photographs and profiles of 11 families.